confidence-inspiring words, I hope that you know what you're going to be talking about today. Anyhow, that naturally filled me with huge self-confidence. I looked up the word rant in the dictionary and saw also the words rave and roar. So I thought I should give a roar for oysters, and of course particularly Colchester oysters, which are simply the best. Roaring reminds me of the missionary in Africa who came face to face with a lion, and the lion let out a roar, and the missionary, realizing his last moments had come, knelt down and started praying. And after a while, nothing had happened, and he looked through his fingers, and he saw that the lion was also on his knees praying. And at that moment, he caught the lion's eye, and the lion said to him, "I don't know what you're doing, but I'm saying grace." So back to oysters. Oysters arrived in this country shortly after the last ice age, about 10,000 years ago, and a few thousand years later the Romans came and made Colchester the capital of Roman Britain. And they named Colchester Camalodunum, and later it took its name from the River Colne on which it lies, the River Colne. So on with history, and Richard I gave it by charter to the borough of Colchester in 1189, and I now want to describe the River Colne lies about 50 miles south of us here, or 40 miles south of us, and is approximately 9 miles in length. A long, tortuous river coming up with Colchester at the head of the estuary. Now, I now want you to come forward a couple of hundred years, and let's tell you the story of the 3 Viking ships. And you must imagine yourself as being a spectator on the banks of the River Colne, seeing these 3 Viking ships coming up the river, and the first 2 with banks of oars rowing rhythmically and in perfect unison, sails furled, and the third one with spars askew, and the rowers, who were all out of time, lolling about on their seats. Well, so they arrived at the quay at Colchester, and the leader of the expedition leapt out, and he said to the skipper of the first boat, "Right," he said, "I want you to go up into the town and carry on with the burning." So they went off up. The second boat came alongside, also very smartly, and the leader turned to the captain of that boat, and he said to him, "Right, now I want you to go up into the town and carry on with the pillaging." And the third boat then came alongside with a terrible crash. All the oars fell out of the boat, and the leader of the expedition said to the skipper, "Right." And the captain of the boat said, "No, not the raping again." Anyhow, 19th century brought the Industrial Revolution, and with it huge demand for fish and shellfish, brought about by the railways. And the Victorians, of course, extolled the virtues of oysters, how good they were for you. And I would like to tell you seriously a little bit about why they're good for you. They have protein, they have virtually no fat, and they have all the trace elements similar to milk. They're very easily digestible. And quite simply, I think it would be true to say there really is no better food for you. They're also good for your production of your brain cells. And when man first was the cradle in Africa, and the migration out of Africa occurred, they took 5 routes. And one of those routes was alongside the sea. And it's interesting to note that those who went alongside the sea in their migration route, their brains developed 5 times as fast as those who went inland. Now, the next thing is, of course, how do we get at our oysters? Well, I think what I should say is that you do need a special oyster knife. And the oyster knife should have a stiff blade, and its point should be very sharp, because you can spend an awful lot of time cutting your fingers and hurting yourself, pushing the knife into the oyster and trying to open it. And what you need, in fact, is if I can hold that, can you do that? Thank you so much. What you actually need is the tip of the oyster blade wants to be a tip of approximately 90 degrees, or better still, if it was slightly curved. So the point of the oyster knife goes into the oyster, and you then twist it, and you can go in either at the heel or you can go at the side of the oyster, and you'll hear a crack, and that will open the oyster. If you've never eaten oysters before, and there may be some of you here who haven't, what I would suggest is, the first time you open the oyster, you cut it up, put it on a plate and cut it up into small pieces, and eat the pieces. Because what you're told a lot of the time is that you should open the oyster, swallow it whole. Nothing could be more ridiculous, because if you swallow something whole, you don't taste it. So you must chew it, and chew it well in order to get the flavour of the oyster. You may want to put some lemon on it, because oysters naturally, when they come out of the sea, are very salty, and lemon actually goes well with oysters, and perhaps a little pepper as well, as we know from Lewis Carroll. They also can be cooked. They're very good in steak and kidney pie, and there are 100 other different ways of cooking and serving them if you look up in cooking, fishery books. Now, I want now to tell you a little story which involves Suffolk. Many years ago, I was at a conference in London, held at Fishmongers' Hall, and there was an emeritus professor who was giving a paper on seabed law. Well, we'd all had lunch, we were all beginning to go to sleep at this point, and he told the story of the American farmer who'd come over from Texas, and he was in America, and he wanted to find a Suffolk farmer. And to his delight, he saw somebody who was leaning over a gate who quite clearly was an agricultural worker. And he went up to him and he said, "Now tell me, my man, do you farm here?" And the man said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Tell me, how many acres do you farm?" And the man said, "Well, we've got about 75-acre farm." And the Texan said, "Well, do you know," he said, "back at home," he said, "I've got a farm, and if I get into my automobile in the beginning of the morning," and he said, "I can drive all day long and all through the following night and all through the following day. And at the end of the second day," he said, "I'll reach the end of my property." Turned to the Suffolk man, who said quite simply, "You know," he said, "we've got a car like that too." Now, finally, I'm often asked if oysters are all they're hyped up to be about your sex life. Well, of course they are. Every year, Colchester hosts its oyster feast, when important celebrities are invited. And several years ago, Admiral Lord Mountbatten was a guest, and he gave a speech after lunch. And at the end of the speech, he said to the assembled multitude of men and women, and after all, he was an old sailor who should know a thing or two about these matters, "As all of us men know, oysters put lead in your pencil." So off you go. Start eating some oysters now. You'll really enjoy them. Thank you very much.